she spilled red wine on his $5,000 Brioni suit. He demanded a fight to break her spirit, expecting a terrified, weeping waitress. What he got was a shattered ego and a brutal introduction to a dormant, lightweight champion. The heavy mahogany doors of Laura, Manhattan's most exclusive, impenetrable Italian dining room, were supposed to keep the city's grime out. For Riley O'Connor, they were just the gates to another kind of prison. Riley was exhausted. Her lower back throbbed a dull, rhythmic ache, a souvenir from a grueling 8-round sparring session earlier that morning at a dilapidated gym in Queens. By night, she wore a crisp, white button-down, a black vest, and a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was 24, carrying a mountain of debt left behind by a father who loved the track more than his family. The loan sharks didn't care that her father was dead. They only cared that the ledger was balanced. So, Riley poured $1,000 bottles of wine for men who tipped in hundreds, swallowing her pride to keep her family's home out of foreclosure. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted the moment Henry Romano walked in. The low hum of wealthy patrons dining on truffles and veal instantly quieted. The clinking of silverware stopped. Henry wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was the head of the Romano Syndicate, a shadow organization that controlled half the ports on the eastern seaboard. He was 30, built like a heavyweight enforcer, with sharp, aristocratic features ruined only by the cold, dead-eyed stare of a predator. He wore power, like a second skin. Beside him walked Dante, his fiercely loyal underboss, and a trailing entourage of men who looked like their tailored suits were hiding heavy artillery. Table 7. Riley, Albert, the sweating, trembling maitre d', hissed into her ear. The Romano table. Do not make eye contact. Do not speak unless spoken to. Pour the Barolo and step back. Go. Riley suppressed a sigh, grabbing the decanter of 1,996 Barolo. She navigated the crowded dining floor with the natural, gliding footwork of a dancer or a fighter. As she approached the table, Henry was deep in conversation, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute silence from his men. He was leaning back in his velvet chair, arrogant and relaxed, one hand gesturing with a lit Cuban cigar. I told the Russians the docks are closed to them, Henry was saying, his dark eyes fixed on Dante. If they try to move the shipments through our sector again, burn the freighters to the waterline. Understood, boss. Dante nodded. Riley approached from Henry's right side. Excuse me, gentlemen, she murmured, her voice steady. She reached out to pour the wine. It wasn't her fault. Enzo, a hulking bodyguard sitting to Henry's left, suddenly shoved his chair back to grab a ringing burner phone from his jacket pocket. The heavy oak chair slammed into the waiter's station behind him, which jolted the table. Henry, reacting to the sudden noise, shifted his weight violently to the right, directly into Riley's path. The heavy crystal decanter clipped Henry's shoulder. The dark, crimson Barolo splashed violently across the lapel of his immaculate, light gray Brioni suit, soaking through the silk tie and staining his crisp white shirt like a fresh wound. A collective gasp echoed through the dining room. Time seemed to freeze. Henry slowly lowered his cigar. He looked down at his ruined suit, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Riley's. The temperature in the room plummeted. Dante and Enzo were out of their chairs in a millisecond, their hands hovering near their waistbands. "I," Albert, the maitre d' squeaked, practically materializing beside them. "Mr. Romano, I am so profoundly sorry. She is fired. Immediately. I will pay for the suit personally." Henry held up a single finger. Albert snapped his mouth shut, trembling. Henry stood up. He was 6'3", towering over Riley's 5'7" frame. He stepped into her personal space, using his sheer physical presence to intimidate. Most people would have withered. Most people would have dropped their gaze, stammered apologies, or cried. Riley didn't flinch. Her breathing remained even. Her chin stayed level. Her eyes a piercing, icy blue locked onto his dark ones. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to drop her center of gravity, slip to the outside, and throw a devastating right cross to his unprotected jaw. But she clamped down on her muscle memory. She needed this job. "You ruined my suit. Henry said softly, the quiet tone far more terrifying than a shout. I apologize, Mr. Romano, Riley said, her voice devoid of panic. Your associate bumped the table. It was an accident. Henry's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to eye contact, let alone defiance. He reached out, his large, rough hand wrapping around her wrist like a vice. It was a calculated move to establish dominance. An accident, he mocked, tightening his grip just enough to cause pain. You have a lot of nerve, sweetheart. Looking at me like you're not terrified. Like you think you can take me. Riley glanced down at his hand on her wrist, then back up to his face. Let go of my arm. Dante chuckled darkly from the side. Boss, want me to drag her out back? No, Henry murmured, his eyes alight with a sudden, cruel amusement. He studied her. The lack of fear fascinated him. It insulted him. He wanted to break that calm facade. You think you're tough. I see it in your eyes. You think because you work in a fancy restaurant, you're safe. He released her wrist with a sudden shove, sending her stumbling back half a step, though she caught her balance effortlessly. I'll make you a deal, Henry announced, his voice carrying just enough for the terrified restaurant to hear. I like a fighter. My private gym. The Iron Foundry in Brooklyn. Tomorrow night. Midnight. You step into the ring with me. Just you and me. 3 rounds. Riley stared at him, genuinely bewildered. You want to fight? A waitress? I want to teach you a lesson in respect, Henry corrected smoothly. You survive 3 rounds without tapping out or crying for your mother. I hand you $50,000 in cash. I pay for my own suit, and I let this little restaurant stay open. He leaned in closer, his cologne mixing with the smell of spilled wine. But if you don't show up, or if I break you in that ring, you work for me. Unpaid. Whatever I need, whenever I need it, until I decide your debt is paid. Albert made a small, pathetic whimpering sound. $50,000 was exactly what Riley needed to get the loan sharks off her family's back forever. Riley looked at the arrogant Mafia boss, taking in his wide shoulders, his heavy, flat-footed stance, and his complete lack of defensive awareness. He was a street brawler, a bully used to people freezing in fear. Midnight, Riley said softly. Don't be late, Mr. Romano. Henry smirked, turned on his heel, and walked out, his men trailing behind him like wolves. The Iron Foundry was less of a gym and more of an underground gladiator arena for the Romano Syndicate. Hidden beneath a converted warehouse in Dumbo, it smelled of expensive leather, cigar smoke, and aggressive testosterone. A full-sized boxing ring sat in the center under harsh, dramatic spotlights, surrounded by weight racks and heavy bags. It was 11:50 p.m. Henry Romano was already in the ring, shirtless, his torso a canvas of dark, intricate tattoos that told the violent history of his family. He was hitting mitts with Dante, throwing heavy, thudding right hands that echoed through the cavernous room. A dozen of his highest-ranking capos and enforcers were lounging on leather sofas around the ring, drinking scotch and laughing. They were waiting for a show. They were waiting for a terrified, trembling waitress to walk through the doors and beg for mercy. Henry intended to play with her, humiliate her, maybe throw a few pulled punches to scare her, and then collect his new servant. It was an exercise in power. At exactly midnight, the heavy metal door at the top of the concrete stairs groaned open. The laughter died down as Riley walked down the steps. She wasn't wearing her waitress uniform. She wore a pair of faded black Muay Thai shorts, a fitted gray athletic tank top, and battered, laceless boxing boots. Her hair was braided tight against her scalp in cornrows. She carried a beat-up canvas duffel bag over one shoulder. There was no fear in her eyes. There was only a cold, mechanical focus. Henry dropped his hands, leaning over the ropes with a wolfish grin. Well, I'll be damned. The little waitress actually showed up. You brought your own gear, too. Cute. Catcalls and jeers erupted from the mobsters. Hey, sweetheart, don't mess up your pretty face, Enzo yelled, taking a sip of whiskey. Riley ignored them. She walked straight to the corner of the ring, dropped her bag, and pulled out a roll of white athletic tape. Without a word, she began wrapping her hands. Her movements were brutally efficient. the tape snapping tight around her knuckles and wrists, the practiced, 1,000 times repeated ritual of a professional. Dante leaned over to Henry. She knows how to wrap her hands, boss. Maybe she takes cardio kickboxing on Tuesdays. Henry laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. Give her a pair of 16-ounce gloves. I don't want to kill her. Just bruise her up a bit. Riley slid the heavy red gloves on, biting the Velcro strap to secure the second one. She climbed through the ropes, the canvas squeaking slightly under her boots. She walked to the center of the ring, standing barefoot in his own ring. Henry looked massive. He had nearly 90 pounds of pure muscle on her. He didn't even bother putting his hands up. He stood with his arms spread wide. An arrogant smile plastered on his handsome face. Rules are simple, Waitress, Henry said, stepping into her space. 3-minute rounds. You can quit whenever you want. Just say the word, and you belong to me. Ring the bell, Riley said, her voice dead flat. Dante hit the metal timekeeper's bell. Ding. Henry didn't move. Ladies first, he mocked. Take your best shot. Freebie. Riley shifted into her stance. It was an instant, imperceptible transformation. Her center of gravity dropped. Her chin tucked behind her left shoulder. Her right hand hovered perfectly by her cheek. The stance wasn't just good. It was flawless. Henry's eyes flickered with a millisecond of confusion, but his ego overrode it. He stepped forward, telegraphing a lazy, sweeping right hook, meant to slap her down to the canvas and end the game early. He never saw her move. Riley didn't block. She didn't retreat. She slipped to the inside of his wide arc by an inch, the wind of his heavy fist ruffling her hair. Using the kinetic energy of his own forward momentum, she pivoted sharply on her lead foot, torquing her hips and shoulders. Crack. Her left hook connected flush with the right side of Henry's jaw. The sound was like a baseball bat hitting a wet sack of cement. The impact snapped Henry's head violently to the side. The arrogant smile was literally punched off his face. His knees buckled, betraying him as a shockwave of neurological static short-circuited his brain. He stumbled sideways, grabbing the top rope to keep from going down, his eyes wide and completely unfocused. The gym went graveyard silent. The clinking of ice in glasses stopped. Enzo froze halfway through, pouring a drink. Dante's jaw dropped. Riley didn't pose. She didn't gloat. She reset her stance immediately, stepping laterally to cut off his escape route, maintaining a predatory distance. Henry shook his head, tasting copper. A thin line of blood trickled from his split lip. The shock morphed instantly into explosive, unadulterated rage. He was Henry Romano. No one humiliated him in front of his men. No one. You dead little bitch, he roared. He abandoned all pretense of a game. He lunged forward like a rabid animal, throwing a wild, ferocious flurry of haymakers, putting all of his 210 pounds behind every swing. He wanted to take her head off, but Riley wasn't there. She moved like a ghost. She bobbed under a massive right hand, rolled under a left hook, and parried a straight jab with a flick of her wrist. Henry was fighting with emotion, burning oxygen, striking at empty air. Riley was fighting with mathematics, angles, distance, timing. She was a ghost haunting him in the center of the ring. Stand still, Henry bellowed, his chest heaving, his face flushed dark red with fury. You're dropping your right hand when you throw the left, Riley stated clinically, her voice carrying over his heavy breathing. Henry roared and threw a massive left hook. Exactly as she predicted, his right hand drifted down toward his chest. Riley didn't slip this time. She stepped inside the arc of his punch. She dug a brutal, turning right hook straight into the soft, unprotected flesh just beneath his ribcage. A liver shot. The human body cannot tough out a liver shot. It is an involuntary biological shutdown. Henry let out a strangled, breathless gasp. The color drained completely from his face, replaced by a sickly, ashen gray. His hands dropped to his sides. His entire body folded inward in sheer, paralyzing agony. Before he could even begin to fall, Riley brought her left hand up in a devastating, picture-perfect uppercut that caught him squarely on the point of the chin. Henry Romano's eyes rolled back into his head. His massive body went completely rigid for a split second, before collapsing backward. He hit the canvas with a resounding, heavy thud that shook the entire ring. He lay there, spread-eagled, staring blankly up at the blinding halogen lights, completely unconscious. The silence in the iron foundry was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and terrifying. 12 hardened Mafia enforcers stared in horrified disbelief at their invincible boss, out cold on the mat, defeated in less than 45 seconds. Riley calmly walked back to her corner. She spat her mouthpiece into her glove, leaned over the ropes, and looked directly at a pale, trembling Dante. "That's one round," Riley said coldly. "Does he want the other two?" The harsh fluorescent lights of the iron foundry glared down on the canvas, casting long, dramatic shadows. Henry Romano lay motionless for exactly 14 seconds. To his men, it felt like a suffocating eternity. When Henry's eyes finally snapped open, there was no gentle return to consciousness. He inhaled sharply. A ragged, desperate gasp, as his bruised liver protested, sending a fresh wave of blinding agony through his torso. He rolled onto his side, coughing violently, tasting copper and bile. Instantly, the spell of shock over the room broke. "Boss!" Dante yelled, scrambling under the ropes, his hand immediately flying to the holster concealed beneath his tailored jacket. The metallic shink of a Glock, 19 being drawn, echoed sharply in the silent gym. Enzo and 3 other enforcers mirrored the movement, converging on the ring with weapons drawn, their faces twisted in panicked rage. 5 black barrels pointed directly at Riley's chest. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't plead for her life. Riley merely pivoted, keeping Dante the closest threat in her direct line of sight. Her breathing was steady, her heart rate decelerating back to a resting rhythm. She had calculated the distance. Dante was 6 feet away, too far to disarm before he pulled the trigger. She was dead, and she knew it. But her face remained a mask of icy stoicism. "Put the guns down," a gravelly, strained voice commanded. Dante froze, his finger resting on the trigger. "Boss." I said. "Put the damn guns down!" Henry roared, the effort causing him to wince as he pushed himself up onto his knees. He spat a mouthful of bloody saliva onto the canvas and glared at his underboss. "It was a sanctioned bout in my ring. You shoot her, you shoot my honor. Stand down. All of you." Reluctantly, Dante lowered the Glock, sliding it back into its holster. The other men slowly followed suit, stepping back but keeping their eyes locked on the waitress who had just dismantled their invincible leader. Henry grabbed the middle rope and hauled himself to his feet. He swayed slightly, his legs feeling like lead, the right side of his jaw already swelling into a grotesque purple mass. He leaned against the turnbuckle, waving off Enzo, who tried to hand him a towel. For a long, agonizing minute, Henry just stared at Riley. The arrogance was gone, entirely evaporated from his dark eyes. In its place was a sharp, calculating intensity. He wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He was looking at a lethal weapon, hidden in plain sight. "Who the hell are you?" Henry finally asked, his voice a raspy whisper. "And don't give me that server from Laura garbage." That was a textbook Philly shell defense, followed by a perfect liver-chin combination. You don't learn that at a cardio kickboxing class. Riley unlaced her left glove with her teeth and pulled it off, tossing it onto the mat. "Riley O'Connor." Dante's head snapped up. "Wait. O'Connor? Brendan O'Connor's kid?" Henry looked at Dante, wiping a streak of blood from his chin. "You know the name?" "Brendan was a degenerate gambler," Dante explained, his eyes wide as he looked back at Riley. "Ran up a massive tab with the Petrov Syndicate over in Brighton Beach. But before he drank himself to death, he was a cornerman at Gleason's gym. Word was he had a daughter who was a phenom. Undefeated pro, 12-0. Knockout artist. She was slated for the 2024 Olympic qualifiers before she vanished off the grid." "I didn't vanish," Riley corrected coldly, unwrapping the athletic tape from her knuckles. "The New York State Athletic Commission pulled my license. I had to take an unsanctioned, bare-knuckle fight in a warehouse in Red Hook to pay off an installment of my father's debt. Vice Squad raided it. I lost my career, my sponsors, and my shot at the gold. So, I pour $1,000 wine for men who think they own the world. Henry listened, the pieces snapping together. The desperation, the coldness, the mechanical, ruthless efficiency in the ring. She wasn't fighting him for pride. She was fighting him for survival. He pushed himself off the ropes and walked slowly to the edge of the ring, looking down at his gym bag. He unzipped it, reaching inside, and pulled out a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. Then another. And another. He tossed 5 stacks into the center of the ring. $50,000. A deal is a deal, Henry said, his voice regaining some of its commanding baritone. Take it. You earned it. Laura stays open, and I pay for my own suit. Riley looked at the cash. A flicker of profound relief, finally breaking through her stoic facade. She grabbed her canvas duffel bag and began sweeping the money inside. But you're a fool if you think that fixes your problem, Henry added softly. Riley zipped the bag and looked up. Excuse me? Ilya Petrov, Henry said, leaning against the ropes, crossing his arms over his tattooed chest. He runs the Brighton Beach crew. They are loan sharks, Riley, not bankers. You hand them 50 grand. They'll say 30 of it covers the accumulated vigorish. They'll slap another penalty on you for being late, and by next month, you'll owe them another 20. They don't let assets go. They bleed them dry. Riley's grip on the duffel bag tightened until her knuckles turned white. She knew he was right. She had known it all along, but she had been running purely on the desperate hope of a clean slate. What do you care? Riley asked defensively. You got your bruised ego? I got my money. We're done. Henry smiled. A genuine, dangerous smile that didn't reach his eyes. Because I don't like seeing a Ferrari used as a golf cart. And because I have a problem of my own. He stepped closer to her. The underground syndicate bouts. Every major crime family puts up a champion. Winner takes control of the shipping lanes for the next 2 years. My champion got his knee shattered by the triads last week. I need a fighter. Someone who doesn't quit. Someone who can hit like a freight train. You want me to fight in a mob tournament? Riley laughed bitterly. I just got out of the ring. I'm not trading one collar for another. I'm not offering you a collar. I'm offering you a partnership, Henry countered, his eyes locked onto hers. The raw, magnetic pull between them was undeniable, forged in the violent exchange of blows. You fight for the Romano family. In exchange, I buy your debt from Petrov. I wipe it clean. No interest, no strings. And you get 20% of the tournament purse. You walk away a millionaire, legally. And until the tournament is over, you work as my personal security. Riley stared at the mob boss. His jaw was black and blue, his lips split. Yet he stood there offering her the keys to her freedom. Why security? She asked, her eyes narrowing. Because, Henry muttered, glancing briefly at Dante with a flash of something unreadable in his eyes. After tonight, I think I need someone guarding my back who can actually throw a punch. 2 weeks later, the entire power dynamic inside the Romano syndicate had completely inverted. Riley O'Connor was no longer a waitress struggling to survive on tips. She was a permanent fixture at Henry Romano's side, dressed in sharp, tailored black suits that perfectly masked her athletic physique. She shadowed him through the cutthroat underbelly of New York as his new, quiet bodyguard. To the outside world, she was just another piece of muscle. Behind the heavily fortified, closed doors of the iron foundry, however, she was the undisputed master, and the terrifying head of the Romano family was her dedicated student. Their midnight training sessions bred a suffocating, undeniable tension. Henry was a remarkably fast learner, driven by a deeply bruised ego and a profound, newfound respect for the woman who had knocked him unconscious in under a minute. He learned to keep his right hand glued to his chin. He mastered the complex geometry of defensive footwork. As they traded sweat and heavy blows under the harsh fluorescent lights, the initial animosity melted into a dangerous electric attraction. Henry was captivated by her relentless, cold discipline. Riley, against her better judgment, found herself drawn to the fiercely protective and honorable man buried beneath the ruthless Mafia exterior. But the real threat wasn't waiting in the boxing ring. It was brewing in the shadows of the city. Petrov finally agreed to a sit-down. Henry announced one rainy Tuesday night. He wiped his flushed face with a white towel as he stepped through the ropes. Tonight. The private dining room at Tatiana in Brighton Beach. We hand over the 50 grand in cash. I transfer a piece of our prime waterfront real estate to cover his absurd interest. And your debt is officially erased. Riley frowned deeply, biting the Velcro of her glove to unwrap her hands. He agreed way too easily. The Russians don't negotiate away a lucrative debt for property they can't easily liquidate without raising alarms. It's a trap, Henry. You know it is. I know, Henry said, his dark eyes hardening into chips of obsidian. He pulled a crisp dress shirt over his broad, tattooed shoulders. But we have to play the game to get the physical paper with your father's signature. Dante has the perimeter completely secured. Enzo and the heavy crew are stationed just outside the blast radius. We go in, make the trade, secure the ledger, and walk out. Midnight at Tatiana restaurant was a surreal, tension-filled scene. The opulent, Soviet kitsch dining room was entirely empty of civilian patrons, save for the dozen heavily armed Russian mobsters lining the velvet-flocked walls. Henry, Riley, and Dante walked into the VIP back room. The air was thick with the smell of rich borscht and cheap, overpowering cologne. Sitting at the head of a long banquet table was Ilya Petrov, a massive, bald man with a jagged scar running down his thick neck. Henry didn't bother sitting down. He tossed a heavy manila envelope onto the polished mahogany table. The cash. And the signed deed to the warehouse on Pier 40. Hand over the O'Connor ledger, Ilya. We're done here. Ilya didn't even glance at the envelope. He slowly sipped his clear vodka, a cruel, predatory smirk spreading across his scarred face. Pier 40 is a very nice gesture, Henry, but I think I prefer to control the whole harbor. Henry's posture stiffened. What the hell are you talking about? He's talking about a permanent change in management, boss, a familiar voice said from directly behind Henry. Riley's blood ran ice cold. She spun around on her heel. Dante had stepped back, putting 10 feet of vital distance between himself and Henry. In his hand was his familiar Glock 19. But this time, the black barrel was pointed squarely at the back of Henry's head. Dante, Henry breathed, the sheer weight of the betrayal hitting him harder than any punch Riley had ever thrown. You went soft, Henry, Dante spat, his hand trembling slightly with adrenaline. You let a woman embarrass you in front of the men. You're giving away prime real estate to pay off a dead degenerate's gambling debts. The family is losing respect on the streets. Ilya offered me the underboss position in a newly merged syndicate. All I have to do is leave you here to bleed. Kill them both, Ilya commanded lazily, waving a dismissive hand. 4 Russian thugs immediately drew their weapons. In the chaotic, hyper-violent world of the mob, survival always comes down to fractions of a second. The Russians expected a desperate plea or a panicked surrender. They didn't expect a lightweight professional boxer with a survival instinct honed by years of poverty. Before Dante could pull the trigger, Riley exploded into violent motion. She stepped inside the fatal funnel. She lunged at the Russian closest to her, on the left, violently swatting the barrel of his Makarov pistol upward just as it fired, the stray bullet shattering the crystal chandelier above. Simultaneously, her right hand closed into a tight fist, driving a devastating, short-range cross directly into the man's exposed throat. He collapsed instantly. Henry didn't hesitate. Fueled by fury, he flipped the heavy banquet table upward with a guttural roar, using it as a massive wooden shield just as the room erupted into a deafening hail of crossfire. Wood splintered and glass shattered as bullets tore through the room. Henry drew his heavy .45 caliber 1911, firing precise, suppressive shots around the edge of the table. Get to the kitchen, Henry yelled over the deafening gunfire. Riley sprinted out from behind the table. Seeing a Russian thug stepping out from behind a pillar, she snatched up a heavy silver serving tray from the floor and hurled it like a deadly frisbee. It caught the man directly in the bridge of his nose with a sickening crunch. She rolled back up to her feet, closing the distance to Dante, who was frantically trying to clear a jam in his Glock. The traitor swung the heavy gun at her head like a club. Riley slipped under the clumsy strike, effortlessly, planted her lead foot, and unleashed a ferocious left hook that connected flush with Dante's temple. He crumpled to the floor, instantly. Henry grabbed her hand, dragging her through the swinging double doors of the kitchen. They sprinted past terrified cooks, vaulting over prep stations as bullets chewed up the stainless steel behind them. Henry kicked open the heavy metal fire exit, and they burst out into the cold, driving rain of the alleyway. Henry's black SUV was idling perfectly at the end of the alley, Enzo pale with panic in the driver's seat. They dove into the back seat just as the Russians burst out of the doors. The SUV's tires shrieked against the wet pavement, tearing down the street. Inside the dark, speeding car, Henry leaned back, his chest heaving. He looked over at Riley. Her suit jacket was torn. Her knuckles were bleeding, and her hair was plastered to her face. "You saved my life back there," Henry said softly. "You could have run out the front door." Riley looked at him, her breathing steadying. "I don't run from a fight, Henry. And I protect my investments. You still owe me 50 grand. Henry let out a low, rumbling laugh, gently taking her bruised, bleeding hand in his. "The 50 grand is yours. But the war with the Russians just started, and I'm going to need the best fighter in New York by my side." The war between the Romano Syndicate and the Petrov Bratva painted the streets of Brooklyn in shades of cold, paranoid dread for a month. But in the underworld, prolonged war is bad for business. The Commission, the shadowy ruling body of the five families, demanded an end to the bloodshed. The mandate was absolute. The dispute would be settled in the syndicate bouts. Winner takes the disputed shipping lanes. The loser leaves New York entirely. The neutral ground was a decommissioned Staten Island ferry, stripped to its steel bones, and anchored 3 miles offshore in international waters. Inside the cavernous vehicle deck, a makeshift boxing ring sat bathed in stark, unforgiving light. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, salt water, and cigar smoke from the city's most dangerous men. In a cramped, rusted locker room below deck, Henry Romano was wrapping Riley's hands. The dynamic between them had shifted from employer and muscle to something fiercely intimate and unbreakable. Henry knelt in front of her, carefully weaving the white athletic tape between her knuckles with surprisingly gentle, practiced hands. He wore a sharp black suit, but his eyes betrayed a deep, restless anxiety he only ever showed to her. "Ilya brought in a ringer," Henry said, his voice a low rumble over the hum of the ferry's generator. "Viktor Volkov, ex-Spetsnaz, dishonorably discharged for beating a superior officer to a pulp. He's got 80 pounds on you, Riley. He doesn't box. He destroys." Riley looked down at the top of Henry's head, her heart executing a slow, steady rhythm. "Let him try. Size just means a bigger target for the liver." Henry tied off the tape and looked up, his dark eyes locking onto her icy blue ones. He reached up, his rough thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "If it goes bad, you tap out. You go down and you stay down. Enzo has a speedboat idling on the starboard side. I don't care about the ports. I don't care about Petrov. I care about you, walking out of here, breathing." "I'm not running, Henry," Riley whispered, leaning into his touch. "And I'm not losing our city." The roar of the crowd above deck signaled it was time. When Riley stepped into the ring, a wave of dismissive laughter and crude bets rippled through the Russian section. Viktor Volkov stood in the opposite corner, a mountain of scarred muscle, completely bald, radiating violent, sociopathic energy. He looked at Riley like a butcher looks at a lamb. The bell shattered the tension. Ding. Victor didn't bother with a stance. He charged like a freight train, throwing a sweeping, clubbing right arm, meant to decapitate her. Riley vanished from his path. She slipped under the massive arm, her footwork a masterclass in geometric precision, and dug 2 sharp, stinging jabs into his ribs. Victor grunted, pivoting and swinging a wild backhand that clipped Riley's shoulder, sending a shockwave of pain down her spine. The sheer force of the glancing blow warned her. One clean hit, and her skull would fracture. For 2 agonizing rounds, it was a deadly game of matador and bull. Riley used her Philly shell defense, deflecting, weaving, and bleeding the giant's stamina. She landed clean, beautiful combinations to his face. But Victor just spat blood and kept coming, fueled by sheer, monstrous rage. By the 3rd round, Riley was fading. Her lungs burned, and a cut over her left eye leaked blood into her vision. Victor backed her into the ropes, raising both fists for a crushing, downward double strike. "Riley, angle out!" Henry roared from the corner, slamming his hands on the canvas. She heard his voice cut through the roaring crowd. Instead of dodging away, Riley stepped into the nightmare. She dropped her weight entirely, squatting under his raised arms, and planted her back foot, drawing on every ounce of torque in her hips. She launched a devastating right uppercut straight up the middle. Her glove connected flawlessly beneath Victor's chin with the sound of a cracking whip. The giant's head snapped backward. His brain collided with the inside of his skull. The forward momentum of his charge, combined with the explosive upward force of her punch, completely short-circuited his central nervous system. Victor's eyes rolled back, his knees liquefied, and the 250-pound monster crashed face-first onto the canvas. The ferry went dead silent, save for the hum of the engine. The referee waved his arms. It was over. Pandemonium erupted. Enzo and Henry's men cheered wildly. Across the ring, Ilya Petrov's face turned a violent shade of purple. He nodded to Dante, who was standing in the shadows, reaching into his jacket. But Henry was already moving. He vaulted the ropes just as Dante drew a suppressed pistol. Henry didn't hesitate. He pulled his 1911 and fired a single, deafening shot that struck Dante in the shoulder, spinning the traitor to the deck before he could aim. Henry turned his gun on Petrov. "The bout is over, Ilya. The ports are mine. Get off my ship, or you don't leave at all." Petrov glared, but the sheer number of Romano guns suddenly aimed at him forced his hand. He turned and spat on the floor, marching his men toward the exit. Henry holstered his weapon and turned to Riley. She was leaning against the turnbuckle, exhausted, bleeding, and smiling. He closed the distance between them, wrapping his arms around her waist, lifting her off the canvas, and pulling her into a fierce, desperate kiss. It tasted of blood, sweat, and absolute victory. "You owe me a lot more than 50 grand now, Romano," she breathed against his lips. Henry smirked, his forehead resting against hers. "I'll spend the rest of my life paying it off, champ." What began as a clash of egos over a spilled glass of Barolo forged an unbreakable empire. Riley traded her waitress apron for the crown of the underground, proving that true power isn't born from intimidation, but from unyielding discipline. Together, the arrogant mafia boss and the professional boxer ruled New York not just with iron fists,